They know that holding on to resentment only hurts the one holding on. Hope understood that you weren't the man who abandoned her on that road anymore. And how did she know? Because when you fell to your knees that day, it wasn't just your body that bowed, it was your pride, your mask, all that hardness you carried. She saw your soul bare and recognized the kindness buried within. Arnold reflected on these words. In recent months, he had discovered that true transformation didn't happen overnight, but in small moments of choice, choosing kindness over harshness, choosing to listen instead of speak, choosing to care instead of feigning indifference. Ernest, can I ask you a personal question? Of course. Weren't you angry when you found out who I was? When you learned that I had abandoned hope? The old carpenter stopped rocking and looked directly at Arnold. I was sad, he admitted. Very sad. But angry? No. You know why? Because anger is a luxury I can't afford. When Mary died, I was very angry at God, the world, life, and that anger almost killed me inside. It made me bitter, closed off, alone. It was only when I learned to transform that anger into compassion that I could live again. And how does one do that? How does one transform anger into compassion? By understanding that the person who hurts you is usually hurt themselves. You abandon hope not because you were evil, but because you had forgotten how to love. And people who forget how to love are always suffering even when they don't admit it. These words touched Arnold deeply. It was true, during all those years of business success, he had been profoundly unhappy, isolated in his arrogance, unable to form genuine connections, always distrusting the motivations of those around him. Mary must have been a very special woman, he said. She was, but do you know what she would say if she were here now? That hope was the angel she sent to save me from loneliness, and that you were the angel she sent to save hope from loneliness too. Me? An angel? Arnold laughed, but not with sarcasm, with a kind of amused astonishment. Why not? Even without knowing it, you were the one who brought hope into my life, and it was through you that she found her true purpose. Sometimes, we are instruments of good things even when our intentions aren't the best. At that moment, as if she had overheard the conversation, Hope approached the porch. Her foal followed, curious as always. The mare stopped in front of the two men and looked at them with those golden eyes that had become a symbol of wisdom and forgiveness for all who knew her. Arnold extended his hand, and she touched it gently with her muzzle, a simple gesture, but full of meaning. It was as if she were saying, "It's all right, we're all where we need to be." "You know that stories like ours don't happen by chance, right?" said Ernest, watching the interaction. "What do you mean?" "I think we all, you, me, Hope, needed each other to become who we were meant to be. You needed to rediscover your humanity. I needed to rediscover my purpose, and Hope needed to find a place where she could transform her pain into healing for others." Arnold nodded, feeling the profound truth of these words. All his life, he'd believed in total control, absolute independence. But now he understood that the best things in life happened when you allowed yourself to be interdependent, when you acknowledged that you needed others as much as they needed you. In the following months, the ranch continued to be a beacon of hope for the region, but perhaps the most lasting impact was the ripple effect of change that spread outward from there. Arnold implemented animal welfare programs throughout his business network. Ernest began receiving visits from veterinary students interested in learning about compassionate animal care. The story even reached the ears of other business owners, some of whom began to rethink their own practices. Dr. Cardoso, Arnold's lawyer, told him he'd started doing pro bono work for animal shelters, inspired by the changes he'd witnessed in his client. "You know what surprises me most about all this?" Arnold said to Ernest during one of their evening conversations. "It's how the happiness I feel now is different from what I thought I felt before." "How so?" "Before, I sought satisfaction in winning, in accumulating, in being above others. It was a happiness that depended on comparison, on feeling that I was better or more successful than others. But this happiness I feel now, it doesn't diminish when others also feel it. In fact, it grows. It's the difference between pleasure and joy," Ernest explained. "Pleasure comes from getting what we want. Joy comes from being who we are meant to be. And who am I meant to be? You already know the answer to that question. You are the man you became when you stopped trying to impress the world and started caring about it. This conversation took place on a special afternoon. It was exactly 1 year since Arnold had shown up at the ranch to rescue his property. To mark the date, he'd brought a special gift, a small stone monument with a plaque that read, "In memory of all second chances and the transformative power of unconditional love." "Where do you want to put this?" he asked. Ernest thought for a moment, then pointed to a spot under a large mango tree, where Hope used to rest on warm afternoons. "There, where she can see every day that her story had meaning." As they placed the monument, Corazon approached, now a young, strong horse, with the same serene dignity as his mother. He sniffed the stone curiously, then looked at the two men, as if he understood the importance of the moment. "He'll carry on her story," Ernest said, stroking the animal's neck. "I can already see it in the people who visit him. He has the same gift as his mother. The gift of healing, the gift of reminding people who they truly are, beneath all the layers of fear and hurt they've accumulated." That night, as he drove home, Arnold reflected on how completely his life had changed. Not just externally, though his business practices, his relationships, and his priorities were entirely different, but internally, he had rediscovered a part of himself he'd thought was dead forever. The man who once saw an injured animal as a problem to be discarded now saw every living being as an opportunity for connection and growth. The businessman who had built his empire by isolating himself from others now found his greatest satisfaction in contributing to the well-being of the community around him. But perhaps the most profound transformation was in his relationship with the concept of success. For decades, he'd measured his worth by the numbers in his bank account, by the size of his properties, by the fearful respect he inspired in others. Now he measured his worth by the quality of his connections, by the peace he felt when he laid his head on his pillow, by the genuine smiles of the people he met. 6 months later, during a routine visit to the ranch, Arnold found Ernest sitting beside Hope, who was lying quietly in the shade. Something about the scene made him pause and observe before approaching. "Is she all right?" he asked, noticing that the mare seemed quieter than usual. "She's getting old," Ernest said, with a mixture of melancholy and acceptance in his voice. "It's natural. She's given the world everything she had to give." Arnold felt a pang in his chest. The thought of losing Hope, the creature who had catalyzed his transformation, was almost unbearable. "How long?" "We don't know. It could be a long time yet. But even when the time comes, she'll pass peacefully, knowing she fulfilled her purpose." "And what was her purpose?" Ernest smiled, gently stroking the mare's mane. "To teach us all that it's never too late to begin again. That love is stronger than abandonment. That healing is possible, even when the wounds seem too deep." At that moment, Hope lifted her head and looked at Arnold. In her eyes, he saw not the weakness of age, but the serenity of one who had lived a meaningful life. It was as if she were saying, "Mission accomplished." Arnold knelt beside her, as he had on that first day, but now not out of shame or remorse, out of gratitude. He placed his hand on her neck and whispered, "Thank you for everything." And so, on a simple ranch in the countryside, 3 wounded souls, a businessman hardened by success, a widower consumed by loneliness, and a mare abandoned to her fate, found the healing they needed through the most powerful bond of all, the love that manifests itself in selfless care for others. Hope's story became a local legend, then a regional one, then a national one. But for those who truly knew her, it was much more than a story. It was a living reminder that transformation is always possible, that forgiveness frees both the forgiver and the forgiven, and that sometimes life's greatest blessings come disguised as its greatest challenges. Ernest continued caring for injured animals until his last days, always with Heart by his side, continuing his mother's legacy. Arnold became one of the most respected businessmen in the country, not because of the size of his fortune, but because of the integrity of his business dealings and the generosity of his heart. And Hope, she lived many more years, always serene, always wise, always reminding everyone who knew her that the true miracle is not the absence of suffering, but the ability to transform that suffering into compassion, healing, and unconditional love. In the end, their story proved that sometimes we need to be broken to discover what we're truly made of, and that when we allow love to seep into the cracks of our seemingly ruined lives, something beautiful and lasting can always bloom. Arnold remained kneeling for several minutes, absorbing Ernest's words and Hope's serene gaze. Slowly, something inside him began to move, like a rusty door being opened after years of being closed. "Dr. Cardoso," he finally said, rising with difficulty, "shred the documents." "Sir?" "Shred the documents. This mare doesn't belong to me anymore. In fact, I think she never really belonged to me." The lawyer tried to protest, but Arnold cut him off with a gesture. "She's where she needs to be," he said, looking at Ernest, "with someone who understands what it means to care." From that day on, something fundamental changed in Arnold Riley. He didn't take Hope back. Instead, he began to visit the farm regularly, initially in silence, just observing how Ernest cared for the animals and received the visitors who continued to arrive seeking healing. On his first few visits, he barely spoke. He sat on a tree stump near the stable and stayed there for hours, as if he were learning a language he had forgotten. He watched how Ernest spoke to Hope and Hart, how he treated each visitor with the same dignity, regardless of their social status or appearance. "Why do you do this?" he asked, one day, after weeks of silence. "Why do you dedicate so much time to people who can't give you anything in return?" Ernest stopped brushing Hope and smiled. "My wife used to say we're only truly wealthy when we share what we have." She didn't mean money, of course. She meant time, care, attention. Those things don't diminish when you give them. They multiply. But you could be doing other things. You could be resting, enjoying your retirement, and doing what? Watching TV alone? Complaining about life? Ernest shook his head. "Since Hope arrived here, I wake up every day with a purpose. People are counting on me. That's worth more than any rest." Arnold absorbed these words in silence. His whole life had been driven by accumulation of money, property, status, power. The idea of finding satisfaction in giving, instead of receiving, was revolutionary to him. Slowly, he began to help, at first timidly, bringing better feed for the animals. Then, offering to repair the leaky stable roof. Eventually, he started talking to the visitors, discovering their stories and needs. It was during one of these conversations that he met Mary Carmen, a retired nurse who came to the ranch every week to find peace after years of caring for terminally ill patients. She had lost faith in humanity after witnessing so much suffering, but something about the serene atmosphere of the property helped her regain hope. "Did you work with horses?" she asked Arnold during one of her visits. "I work with horses," he said, automatically correcting himself. "I own a stud farm in the city." "And do you enjoy it?" The question caught him off guard. When was the last time someone had asked him if he enjoyed his work, instead of how much money he made from it? "Used to," he admitted. "When I started, it was for the love of horses, but somewhere along the way, it became just business." "It's never too late to go back to the beginning," said Mary Carmen, with a gentle smile. "Sometimes we need to get a little lost to remember why we started." These conversations planted seeds of change that began to sprout in Arnold's life. He started questioning his business practices, the way he treated his employees, the way he had distanced himself from the people who truly mattered. He began visiting his mother, who lived in a modest nursing home in his hometown, a place he had abandoned years ago. She barely recognized him, not only because of her advanced age, but because he had become a completely different person from the son she had raised. "Mom, it's me, Arnold," he said, holding her frail hand. She looked at him for a long moment, her tired eyes trying to focus. "Arnold," she whispered. "My son Arnold was a good boy. He took care of the hurt animals he found on the street." The words hit him like a punch to the chest. It was true. As a child, he always brought home injured birds, lost cats, any creature that needed help. When had he lost that part of himself? On subsequent visits to his mother, she began to show signs of recognition, and with each conversation, Arnold felt as if he were rediscovering who he had been before becoming who he was. Back at the ranch, these reflections intensified. Watching Ernest care for Hope and Hart with such dedication reminded him of the pure love he had felt for animals in his youth. Gradually, he began to implement changes at his stud farm. He improved the horses' facilities, hired more staff so that no animal would be left without proper attention, and established a retirement program for older horses, instead of simply selling them when they were no longer competitive. His changes did not go unnoticed. Other horse owners began to comment on Arnold Riley's new philosophy. Some criticized him, calling him sentimental. Others, inspired, began to adopt similar practices. But the most profound transformation happened in his relationships with people. Ernest had shown him, by example, that true wealth lay in the ability to genuinely connect with other beings, human or animal. 6 months after his first encounter with Hope at the ranch, Arnold made a decision that surprised everyone. He announced that he would allocate 60% of his annual profits to a fund for the care of abandoned animals and support for small rural producers in the region. "Why are you doing this?" asked Dr. Cardoso, concerned about the financial implications. "Because I learned that when you give your best to something that truly matters, you get back much more than you imagine," Arnold replied. "And because I finally understood that real success isn't measured by what you accumulate, but by what you leave behind." Ernest's ranch continued to be a meeting point for people seeking healing and transformation, but now it had become something even greater, the center of a network of solidarity that spread throughout the region. Other injured animals began to be brought there, and volunteers appeared regularly to help with care. Hart grew strong and healthy, inheriting from her mother the special ability to reassure people simply with her presence. She became an integral part of the animal-assisted therapy sessions that informally took place on the property. Arnold, who had arrived there intending to reclaim a lost property, ended up reclaiming something far more valuable, his own humanity. And he discovered that, in doing so, he had found a form of success more profound and lasting than anything money could buy. One afternoon, as they watched Hope and Hart graze in the small field behind the house, Ernest and Arnold talked about the changes that had taken place in their lives. "You know she forgave you, don't you?" said Ernest, pointing to Hope. "How can you be sure?" "Because animals don't hold grudges. They live in the present, and in the present, you're a different person from the one who abandoned her on that road." Arnold nodded, feeling the weight of the truth in those words. He had spent months punishing himself for the past, but perhaps it was time to learn from Hope to live in the present with gratitude. "Ernest," he said, "I want to make a proposal. How about we expand this? We could create an official sanctuary for rescued animals. I can provide the resources, and you can continue to be the heart of the place." The old carpenter smiled, but shook his head. "It doesn't need to be anything official, my friend. What happens here works precisely because it's simple, genuine. It's not about having more resources or bigger facilities. It's about having more love. Then how can I truly help? Continue being who you're becoming. Keep spreading what you've learned here. Every person you touch with kindness will touch others, and so on. That's how the world changes, one soul at a time." In the months that followed, the story of Hope, Ernest and Arnold spread far beyond the borders of Oakhaven, not only through the media, but through the people themselves who had been touched by their lives. John, the autistic boy who had spoken his first word by touching Hope, began to speak regularly, and became a passionate advocate for animal rights. Anna Beatrice, who had become pregnant after her visit to the farm, named her daughter Hope, in honor of the mare that had renewed her faith in the possibility of life. Professor Michael, who had regained his voice, returned to teaching, but now included stories about compassion and second chances in his lessons. Mary Carmen, the retired nurse, created a support group for caregivers that met monthly at the farm. And Arnold, he became a constant presence in the community, not only as a benefactor, but as someone genuinely interested in the well-being of those around him. His stud farm transformed into a model of ethical animal treatment, and he began lecturing at universities on responsible business and personal transformation. But perhaps the most significant change was in how he related to himself. The arrogant and insensitive man, who had abandoned a wounded mare on the road, had found his lost humanity, and with it, a peace that no amount of money could buy. On a golden autumn afternoon, almost a year after the first meeting at the farm, Ernest and Arnold were sitting on the porch of the small house, watching Hope and her foal play in the field. The foal, now a young horse full of energy, ran in circles around its mother, who watched him with the serene patience that had become her trademark. "You know what impresses me most," said Arnold, breaking a comfortable silence. "It's how she never showed anger. Not even when I first showed up here." Ernest slowly rocked in his rocking chair, a gentle smile on his face. "Animals have a wisdom we've lost somewhere along the way." When Arnold Riley knelt before the mare he had abandoned, his hands trembled not from fear, but from recognition. In the animal's golden eyes, he saw reflected every cruelty he had committed, every life discarded as if it were trash, and for the first time in his 50 years of existence, he understood the true weight of his choices. But this story began 3 months earlier, on a cold, damp morning on the rural road that cut through the forgotten fields of the countryside. The clouds covered the sky like a leaden shroud, and the wind carried an unsettling silence. It was in this desolate setting that old Ernest, a solitary man living on an isolated farm, witnessed a scene that would change his life forever. At the roadside, amongst the mud and broken branches, lay a mare covered in wounds, her belly swollen with pregnancy, her eyes brimming with pain and fear. The animal had been abandoned there by the magnate Arnold Riley, an arrogant millionaire known for treating his racehorses as mere financial assets. Upon discovering that the mare was pregnant and injured after a fall in his luxurious stable, he decided to discard her like a broken object, instructing that she be left far enough away to not make a fuss. To him she represented only loss, a broodmare that could no longer compete, an unnecessary expense on his balance sheet. Ernest, a widower with no children, felt his life dragging on without meaning since the loss of his wife Mary over a decade ago. He had worked his whole life as a carpenter in the small town of Oakhaven, crafting furniture with his own hands, but retirement had brought only loneliness and the echo of empty days to his modest farm. When he saw the mare that morning, something in her eyes, a mixture of pain and resilience, touched a forgotten place in his heart. "Easy, girl," he whispered, approaching slowly. "No one's going to hurt you anymore." Without hesitation, he loaded her onto the old cart pulled by his donkey, Benedict, and took her to his property. During the journey, he observed how she looked at him, not with the typical distrust of a wounded animal, but with a kind of silent gratitude, as if she knew she was finally safe. He named her Hope, as if naming the animal was also naming a new purpose for himself. "You know, Hope," he said, as he settled her into the small stable he had built years ago for his chickens, "I feel abandoned sometimes too. Maybe we can take care of each other." In the days that followed, Hope's recovery was slow and difficult. Ernest treated her wounds with herbs he had learned to use from Mary, who had been a midwife in the region. The birth was approaching, and the fear that both the mare and the foal would not survive was constant. He had no money to pay a vet, only his calloused hands and a heart willing to fight. However, the bond that was forming between him and Ernest was something that words could not explain. He caressed her tenderly, talked to her as if she were human, and spent hours by her side, especially on nights when she seemed more restless. "Mary always said that talking to animals was good for their souls and ours too," he murmured, stroking the animal's tangled mane. "She was right about almost everything." It was as if this wounded creature had come to rescue his soul before he even realized he needed saving. During the weeks of care, Ernest discovered details about Hope's origin through conversations in the village. Mrs. Conception, who worked at the post office, had overheard comments about a wealthy businessman who had gotten rid of a pregnant mare. Father Anthony mentioned that some parishioners had commented on the cruelty of certain people from the big city. Gradually, The name of Arnold Riley emerged from the conversations, along with stories of his arrogance and contempt for the less fortunate. "He's a man who forgot where he came from," said Old Joe, the retired blacksmith. "They say he was poor when he arrived here, about 20 years ago. Now that he's become rich with racehorses and businesses in the capital, he treats everyone like trash." "Dr. Cardoso," he said, his voice controlled but charged with irritation, "I want you to prepare the documents to claim that animal. We're getting her back." "Sir, technically she was abandoned. The man who found her could claim." "I don't care what he can claim," Arnold interrupted. "That mare is my registered property. I have the papers, and I want her back before this story causes more damage to my reputation." 3 days later, Arnold arrived at Ernest's farmhouse in a black Mercedes-Benz, accompanied by Dr. Cardoso and another lawyer. The contrast between the luxury of the car and the simplicity of the place was shocking. The modest property, with its faded blue wooden house, the dirt backyard where chickens pecked freely, and the small stable where Esperanza and Corazon rested. Ernest was watering his small vegetable garden when he heard the sound of cars arriving. He immediately recognized the type of visitors by the posture of the men getting out of the vehicles: expensive suits, serious expressions, documents in hand. "Are you Ernest Silva, Dr. Cardoso asked, taking the lead in the negotiation. "That's me. How can I help you?" "I'm Dr. Cardoso, lawyer for Mr. Arnold Riley," he said, gesturing towards the businessman. "We've come to retrieve a mare that belongs to my client. We have all the documents here that prove ownership." Ernest looked at Arnold, who stood a few steps behind, observing the scene with an expression of barely concealed disdain. He was a tall man with neatly trimmed gray hair, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Ernest had earned in months when he still worked. "What's this about?" Ernest asked, though he knew exactly what it was. "The mare you found on the road a few months ago. She was accidentally lost, and we want to take her back." Ernest felt a tightness in his chest. For months, he had mentally prepared himself for this moment, knowing that one day the true owner might appear. But now that it was happening, the pain was more intense than he had imagined. "Accidentally lost," he repeated, his voice a mixture of disbelief and sadness. "She was injured, sir. Abandoned in the rain, pregnant and hurt. She nearly died." "That's irrelevant to the legal issue," the second lawyer interjected. "The fact is, she belongs to Mr. Riley, and we want her back, along with the foal, of course." It was then that Arnold finally spoke, stepping forward. "Where is she? I want to see her." Ernest hesitated for a moment, then nodded toward the stable. "Over there." "But she's right here." She found peace. They walked in silence to the small stable. When Hope saw the strangers approaching, she raised her head curiously, but showed no fear. Hart, now 3 months old, was playing near his mother, bouncing with the typical energy of young foals. Arnold stopped at the stable entrance, observing the animals. Hope was unrecognizable compared to the state she was in when he ordered her removed from his property. Her coat shone with health, her muscles were well defined, and there was a serenity in her movements he had never noticed before. "It's her," he said, more to himself than to the other. But when he tried to approach closer, something strange happened. Hope slowly rose and walked toward him, not with the fearful submission he was used to seeing in his horses, but with an almost human dignity. She stopped a few feet away and looked him directly in the eyes. It was at that moment that Arnold felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: genuine remorse. In Hope's golden eyes, he saw not only the animal he had discarded, but a reflection of all his cruel choices over the years. He saw the employees he had dismissed without consideration, the small suppliers he had broken contracts with unfairly, the animals he had treated as mere commodities. The businessman began to feel dizzy, cold sweat dripping down his forehead. His legs gave way, and to everyone's surprise, he fell to his knees on the packed earth floor of the stable. "Mr. Riley!" exclaimed Dr. Cardoso, rushing to help him. But Arnold barely heard. He was lost in a whirlwind of memories and emotions he had spent his whole life suppressing. He remembered his poor childhood, how he had promised his mother he would never forget his humble origins. He remembered the first horse he had owned, an old gentle animal he had bought with his years of savings when he was just a young dreamer. Hope approached closer, lowering her head until her eyes were level with his. For a moment, it was as if she could see directly into his soul, recognizing both the darkness and the small spark of goodness that still existed there. As a light rain began to fall on them all, Ernest knelt beside Arnold, not with anger or satisfaction at seeing the powerful man humbled, but with the compassion he had learned through years of loss and suffering. "You can still change," he said, his voice soft but firm. "It's never too late to choose to be different." Arnold looked at the simple man who had cared for the animal he had abandoned, and saw in him something he had lost a long time ago: genuine humanity, without pretensions, without social masks, just the raw kindness of someone who had faced pain and chosen to continue loving. "I didn't know," Arnold whispered, his voice choked. "When I sent her away, I only thought about the loss. I didn't think she was suffering." "But she survived," said Ernest, "and she brought new life into the world. Sometimes, the bad things that happen to us can become the beginning of something beautiful." The lawyers watched the scene with discomfort, unsure how to proceed. The situation had completely spun out of control, escaping the legal script they had prepared.